This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast. Welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Please consider rating and reviewing the podcast on podchaser.com or the Apple Podcast Store, and subscribe wherever you are listening. I'm recording this intro on August 7th. On August 8th, the slate of podcast awards on podcastawards.com will be announced. If by chance we make it into the spirituality and religion category, please vote for the podcast. You have from August 9th to September 13th to vote. Special thanks to Mike T for editing today's podcast. My guest today is Jason. Jason grew up a pastor's kid in an offshoot of Church of Christ that happened to allow music. He grew up doing sword drills. He eventually played music in worship bands. He was a dedicated Christian. He began to question in his early adulthood on the question of bad language. Why is bad language bad? And going back to the Bible to find out why. He also began to question the limited role of women and the purity culture. When he got married to his wife, they saw each other as team members and equals, and that didn't quite fit. Eventually, he and his wife began attending an Episcopal church that didn't include music, which made Jason feel a lot more comfortable, as he had begun to recognize the manipulation within worship. One of the last straws is his love for his dog, and he began to recognize that he could never punish his dog, even if his dog had done something terribly wrong. And this idea of an all-loving God and hell, no matter what version of it one subscribes to, did not make logical sense. Jason found the podcast through Captain Cassidy's Roll to Disbelieve blog, which we highly recommend here at the podcast. I'll have links in the show notes for that. Here's my conversation with Jason. Jason, welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Jason, it's great. One of the wonderful things about doing the podcast is people like yourself reach out to me and tell me a little bit about your story in email, and then I get to have you on. So thank you for joining me.
Well, I'm glad to be here. I'm excited to talk to you. I've been enjoying the podcast, and so I'm excited to share my story.
That's fantastic. Well, let's jump right into it. What was your faith tradition growing up, and what was that like for you?
All right. I grew up in the independent Christian churches, which they like to think of themselves as not a denomination,
Right.
even though they totally are. Most people are probably familiar with the churches of Christ that don't allow instruments, the non-instrumental churches. They're basically the same body of churches, just the one I grew up in allowed instruments and all of that. So
kind of doctrinally, other than the music issue,
yes,
very similar to Church of Christ.
That was very similar. And so I grew up, my father was a pastor, so I was a preacher's kid. Grew up very indoctrinated, very much part of it. And I was very happy in it. That was just what I knew. And so growing up, I was kind of a little preacher boy. I preached my first sermon at like 7 or 8. And,
wow.
Okay. I've always been a rule follower. So my parents their thing was religion. Their thing was Christianity. And so that was what I was full on into that growing up.
Right.
And so as a youngster, I, memorized lots of Bible passages. I was very excited about Bible trivia, very involved at churches, always wanting to read the Bible. Even if we were having any opportunity for that in the church. Loved sword drills. I was always really good at finding the Bible passage. If anyone doesn't know what a sword drill is, it's they name a Bible verse and everybody in the room tries to find it first. And I was good at finding it really quickly.
Yeah.
So I grew up immersed in that, very much a part of that culture. And, that was part of me growing up.
And it's good for you to mention, that it was a positive experience, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's okay. I think we have a variety of people on the show where Some people it's bad from the get go, and other people, have really fond memories. And it
Hmm.
sounds to me like you're saying that, for the most part, it was pretty good, other than the
Yeah.
indoctrination.
Oh yeah. Well, and that was honestly one of the reasons I wanted to uh, talk to you on this, because I think there was a researcher you had on a while back who, when he kind of boiled down the story of deconversion, my initial thought was, well, yours didn't fall into his
Right.
thing that he had, and mine doesn't either. I don't have a religious trauma. I don't have something that would there was no, like, I'm not angry at the church for anything that happened to me.
Right.
If there's any anger at the church, it's for things done over time to loads of other people, especially, and so for me, honestly, the church was a place of privilege. I'm a cis white male
Yeah.
in the Christian churches where, male leadership is the considered the thing to do. So for me, if I really wanted to stay safe and comfortable and in a place of privilege, that would be the perfect spot for me. So I didn't go seeking out of rebellion. I didn't, I was just interested in reality and truth. And so, as you'll see as I continue the story, that's kind of what led me out of everything.
Right. And I apologize for interrupting you. So let's continue on. You were the sword master. You were the Bible drill person.
Well, yeah, and that ended up, a few years later, I joined what was called Bible Bowl. So think quiz bowl sort of thing, but with the Bible. And I literally memorized entire books of the Bible, and this was part of it. And um, I actually have a lot of fond memories of that. That was a way of socialization. I was homeschooled. My parents, for religious reasons, homeschooled me and all of my siblings, and so that was part of my socialization as a junior high schooler, traveling around, competing about who basically knew more about the Bible. And I was decent at it. I was never, top tier, but I was like, right below that
Competitive.
kind of. So I was, I had a lot of fun with it. Met some people that, you know, there's still people that I talk to today that, I met from those days. So,
Sure. Yeah.
so I was very involved with youth group. Then, as a teenager, very much like I was there for all the church services and for, calling on people. We did a Monday night calling thing where
Okay.
they would have some of the teenagers go out and, try to meet people and do stuff. And I was part of that. I started playing music when I was 15, and I started playing guitar. And so I started playing in the praise bands and started doing all that. So any way I could connect and, be involved, that was kind of what I did as my, in growing up into high school.
Right.
And so then I graduated from high school, and trying to figure out what I wanted to do, I actually had scholarships from Bible Bowl to the Christian college that my dad went to and my grandfather went to. And so then I ended up going to Christian college.
Okay.
And uh, so that was, I still say the good things that I got from that I'm happy for now. I met my wife there. We met freshman year, but we didn't start dating until a few years later.
Yeah.
And then I took some music theory classes there. That was helpful.
Okay.
And then I've heard you say that your professors taught you a little too well.
Yes.
They
Exactly.
helped you learn how to think through some things.
Yeah.
In my case, I don't know that they helped me think through things very well necessarily, but I definitely was introduced to some new ideas, such as how the Bible came to be. That was something that, I don't. It's hard to think back, 20 or so years ago now, trying to think back what I actually believed at the time, but I think that I kind of had this notion that God was just whispering into the ears of the writers, and that
Yeah.
all of a sudden this book was here and it was perfect, and you know all the things that I used to, I just, it was kind of a magic book. And then learning how the canon was actually put together, and that not everyone agreed with the canon, that certain people thought that certain books shouldn't be in there or didn't like certain passages. Those thoughts just were never something that I was introduced to before Christian college. And so it was an interesting, there was no intention for them to introduce me to anything that would shake my faith. And it didn't, but it was really just something that was like, oh, here's how this actually came about. It was just the truth of it, the reality of it.
I definitely remember those classes where, I had a couple of very, very conservative, theologically conservative professors, and they would be teaching on the canonization process, and you could tell the care with which they were trying to express things, trying to give you enough information so that you didn't get blindsided by it outside of that context, but also maintain this idea of inspiration through this process. And yeah, that's very, very challenging.
Hmm. I look back at that as one of the initial things that just made me start to kind of go, you know,
Yeah,
what else did I not know,
yeah,
and
that is a dangerous question, sir.
it is.
Yeah,
I mean, that's really the question that I kept asking over the years that eventually led me out of it. Um, and so, yeah, so that was kind of an initial thing. I remember reading The Case for Christ as part of our curriculum there, and I'd only ever heard of it
uh-huh.
through my parents talked about it, that kind of thing. And when I read it, even as an 18, 19-year-old, whatever I was, reading it as a very devout believer, I was not impressed by it because it just didn't, there was no intellectual rigor there. There was nothing honest about it. He wasn't checking with people who were outside of the faith and trying to come to a conclusion. It was just very much, I could like see the trying to force the issue, trying to force the indoctrination, however you want to put it. But like it was not compelling to me even as a very devout young believer.
Right.
And so that was kind of a thing that started my questioning about apologetics. Like this is supposedly one of the big apologetics books, and I'm reading it going, this is not compelling, even as someone who wasn't really asking questions yet at the time.
Right. Wow. Yeah, I've got to respond to that real
Okay.
quick, Jason. I've made it clear that, I've had a rough relationship with apologetics, very similar to what you're describing. And the way I like to say it is I was convinced of the conclusions by faith, but I was acutely aware, or becoming more acutely aware, of the problems with the actual arguments. And Lee Strobel's book, A Case for Christ, I actually probably had just not read the whole thing, but read it after my deconversion. And it was one of those, wow, I can't believe that this is, lifted up as a pinnacle of apologetic work in some way.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah, it was startling to me, I think, almost just how almost pitiful the arguments were, like just from I think most of my apologetics that I'd come across before that, I already, like you said, accepted the premise and accepted the conclusion, so I didn't think about it too much. And then I also, liked C.S. Lewis, so
yeah,
even though I disagree with his conclusions now and everything, he was still like the way he approached it was just very different than the Lee Strobel approach, which was just ham-fisted, and it was just that really shook me a little bit, for apologetics. And so again, I started asking that question, what else have I not been told? What else have I missed? And so from there, I feel like there were several, I don't know, just several things that I hit on that were like, well, even studying from a biblical perspective, some of the things I was taught was I grew up in a very conservative household. You didn't curse, you didn't, say, and you didn't say bad words, you didn't say cuss words. And I remember doing a study on the Bible and what does the Bible actually say about that, because as I was moving into adulthood, I started, working around people that weren't Christians, and so I'd hear this, and I was trying to be gracious to them and try to think, well, try to view them in the most positive light possible. But some of these people are saying things that I'm just, my little pretty, pretty sensitive ears at the time. Like
yes,
I never really encountered this kind of talk and these kinds of things before. Started working on construction sites. I was installing alarm systems, and that was when I really started hearing stuff that just was like, whoa. And so I started studying that from a biblical perspective. And when I realized that, the Bible pretty much anywhere it talks about poorer language, it almost always contrasts that with language that builds people up, language that builds up. And so my conclusion then, even from a biblical perspective, was who cares about if someone uses, drops an F bomb or whatever? Like,
yeah,
And to this day, probably the best compliment I've ever received was from a guy who was a very, very excellent musician who came up to me after a show and was like, "Man, you guys have got some fucking chops." And I was like, "That is just the,
Yes.
one of the best compliments I've ever received." And so starting to think through things more from, now I would call it a humanist perspective of what
Yeah.
actually builds people up, what actually helps people, rather than just a list of rules of don't say this, don't say this, don't say this. That was a big step for me starting to think through what actually matters here. Is it, you know, I can check off this list of things I don't do or don't say or whatever, or I can try to treat people well. And, that really kind of, it just kind of changed the way I thought about things, and, really affected some of the way I even viewed things I was taught. So once again, that question of what, this seemed to be a little bit off from what I was taught. So what else is there?
Right. I felt that very strongly. Like when I got to church as a teenager, I thought, man, have you read Jesus? Do you know? Like he was hanging out with prostitutes and the dregs of society
Uh-huh.
and engaged with those people. So why is it that we're so offended by an F bomb that we can't actually talk to a person? That felt like something has gone drastically wrong here. But
Uh-huh.
interesting, yeah.
So yes, I would say the first, I call them like the easy things to see through. So drinking, smoking, cursing, those kinds of things where it's like, even from a biblical perspective, the conservative prohibition that I grew up with didn't really make any sense.
Yeah.
Maybe if you personally don't want to drink because you don't think it's good for you, whatever, great. But then to put that prohibition on others, well, Paul tells Timothy to, drink wine, and Jesus turned water into wine. And, there's a passage in the Old Testament about bring your strong drink to celebrate before the Lord. These sort of things, those kind of things just really kind of threw the way I was thinking about things, the way I was taught, because my world was so small with what I grew up in. It was very, as long as you stick within these bounds, you're going to be fine. And these were some of the things that just made me start questioning and thinking through things. And at this point, I'm still, just thinking them through, even trying to come to a biblical perspective on them. But those were some that really started to just shake what I was taught and started making me think.
Yeah.
And and then I would say probably the next one that was huge for me was, the topic of what, of women, and what is their place in church and
Right.
society and all of that. And so my wife and I got together when we were 22. So we were still pretty young, but, um, somewhere between that 18 to 22, I was starting to, I'd grown up with the whole notion of purity culture and whatnot. I had done the courtship thing,
Okay.
with one girl when I was 20, and, it was like, I looking at that framework, I think it's more damaging than just
Absolutely.
about anything, because you go in thinking, well, if my parents are for it, if her parents are for it, and if I'm for it, then, this means we're going to get married and whatever, because you're supposed to think about marriage with the whole thing. And
Right.
like we had no chemistry together. There was nothing there other than like we were all, we were good Christian kids and whatever.
We've documented quite a bit of the damage that purity culture has inflicted, particularly on women, but
Hmm.
men as well. But one of the things I think that you've touched on there that it doesn't get talked about as much is you're in this very small pool of available, partners,
Hmm.
and you have this immense pressure to be focused on marriage, and so you wind up making you're settling, right? You're taking, well, this is the person that's available.
Uh-huh.
Now maybe like you went to Bible college, and I'm sure you got to meet lots more people. But like if you're just grow up in the church and you stay in your hometown, that's a very small pool of people to select
Hmm.
from, and people feel that obligation, wind up getting married very very early, and that itself can be deeply destructive.
Oh, huge.
Yeah.
There's a lot of there's quite a number of people that I knew from those days that got married, 18, 19, and it did not work well, did not last. They were not well suited. Um, so yeah, so it really, like, there's just, you know generally I try to find the positives in things, and I don't think there's a whole lot of positives that can be said for the purity culture mindset. Like I don't, I think the things that they were trying to save people from, they end up compounding typically. And so for me, thankfully, I don't, I mean, as far as damage to myself from it, I was fortunate in that there wasn't too much, other than that one, relationship that ended up being more devastating to me when it ended than it should have been, because there shouldn't have been anything there to begin with,
Right.
But after something about that made me think through some of that, and I was like, the thing it's trying to keep us from doing essentially is trying to keep kids from having sex. And it's like, maybe we should think about respect and care for the other person. And if we treat the other person with respect and we find someone that we respect, then maybe, I don't know, maybe that doesn't become such a big deal anymore. And it's not, I don't know, maybe that's not the only thing we focus on.
Yeah, it seems like that was the entire focus was, the worst sin possible was sexual sin in some way or another. And it winds up in this very vicious feedback loop of, you know, 18, 20-year-olds are going to have sex. They have sex and then they feel guilty and they go, back and confess. And then, it's just this repetitive cycle over and over and over
Mm-hmm.
again. And it's a shame cycle that is just devastating.
Oh yeah. And so I'm like I said, I'm thankful to coming out of that. It was not too terrible for me. And I'm really thankful that my wife just kind of like almost seemingly ignored it, even though, like, I mean, you know, she still believed it, but she, like, I don't know, somehow she did not internalize a lot of the real negative things there, which I'm thankful for, because the church was negative for her in a lot of ways, but that one was not necessarily positive, but it could have been a lot worse than it was. And so by the time we got together, whatever, 4 years after graduating high school, by then, I'd already made, when we got married, we decided we weren't going to have any of the obey stuff in the wedding
Okay.
ceremony. Like,
Yeah. Good for you. Yeah.
we're like, we're going to be a team. We're going to be, I don't even remember how I'd kind of made that shift, but somewhere in there, like, realizing that respect needed to be, it needed to be a two-way street. That whole men need respect, women need love thing is stupid. We all need both.
Yes.
So, so that getting together with her and having that mindset, that was a big shift from what I'd grown up with. And it was good, because it's, we've, to this day, we've been a team. Like, that's been who we are, what we do.
That's fantastic. So one of the negative sides for men in the purity culture is then a man gets into a relationship with a strong, independent, autonomous woman, and their entire ego can be crushed by that, because the reality of a full-blown human being who has their own wishes, desires, and opinions can be quite shocking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and thankfully that, we pretty well, I think, avoided that
Yeah, it sounds like it.
that pitfall. Thankfully, I'm very thankful for that. And that's, even to this day, and I can talk more about it later, but she's still a believer. But
Okay.
even to this day, like, that mutual respect helps us, even though we don't necessarily agree, on the religious thing anymore. I guess the next kind of things that happen, getting settling into married life, working and everything. um I had been leading music for a church that was about an hour away from where we lived. And I'd been doing that for a few years before we got married, and then continued. And after a few years, my wife especially was very over the evangelical way of doing church. Like, she was just, she had never, it had never quite clicked with her, like, ever.
Yeah.
She was also she was a daughter of a preacher, and so, like, also grew up, kind of seeing behind the scenes, and behind the scenes can be kind of ugly sometimes. And so she actually, at that point, was probably more like along a deconstruction path than I was, even,
Okay.
um, in many ways. This was a period where we kind of were going through it together. We were starting to read more, like Rachel Held Evans, Matthew Paul Turner, some of the Fred Clark, some of the more progressive evangelicals. I was reading, we were reading things like Peter Enns and N.T. Wright, and some of the just more scholarly, here's what actually, scholars actually say about the Bible kind of stuff,
Right.
And so when it was time for us, when we determined it was time for us to move on, we were trying to figure out what kind of church we could settle in. And we tried several different varieties. For me, it would have been easier just because playing music, I could drop in somewhere and be like, hey, you need someone to play in your band. I can,
Right.
sure,
Yeah.
We ended up landing in the Episcopal Church,
Okay.
which ended up being really good. I end up going to a service that doesn't have music, which I actually still to this day prefer if I'm going to go to a service. And just something about music, I'm too familiar with it. Like I can spot what's trying to happen, and like it. So I think I can't remember if I've heard you talk about it, but just or maybe it was something at somebody else, but just once you're familiar with it, you can, especially now, I can just see the manipulation that's going
Absolutely.
on there.
Yeah.
If we drop it into the minor key here, slow it down here, raise the lights here, like I know all that stuff, and so it just, to me, it just kind of like, I don't know, like I could try to pull those moods off myself. Like I don't know, it didn't work for me. So going to that service without music was good.
That's fascinating because
Yeah.
definitely we've had a bunch of worship leaders on, or musicians that talk about that format, the pattern, what have you. And yes, then to hear you describe that, not being comfortable with it, is really fascinating. So,
Well, and I kind of just think it. I don't know if that was some of the early. I mean, at this point, we're getting kind of halfway to that, almost the halfway point, probably, of where I'm starting to think through some more of this stuff, and I don't know if that was some of my initial discomfort or whatever, but it landed, and it was a good place for us. She joined the choir, and we have the organ and the choir, and so it's a different type of music than I do. I do modern rock, pop, blues type stuff. That's what I've played, and that's what I know. And so for her, she's got a voice that's much more geared for the orchestral classical stylings, and so it was a good fit for her as well. Um, Something about the liturgy that allows us to slow down and think about the words, or not, whatever you're going through. Like something about that worked for both of us.
yeah,
And this was another spot that I found to be different from. I can't remember exactly what he said, but the researcher who said, when he was saying that, the I think he said something along the lines of, a lot of people just leave. They don't go seek out a church that works for them, because they didn't try the right flavor of Christianity, whatever.
yes,
And like I did,
yeah,
like I to this
yeah,
day, if I go to an Episcopal service, I don't want to run away. The last time I went to an evangelical service, I felt like I needed to have a shower. Like
yeah,
it felt gross to me. No, it was a specific type of evangelical service that some others might not be quite so bad.
yeah. So I've had two researchers on. The guy with from Switching Sides is probably who you're talking about, and they are really apologists
Hmm.
under the hood, right? And it's really not anything but an apologetics effort. And so what was difficult about doing both of those interviews was not attacking, like not responding to everything they said that was crazy, right? And
Uh-huh.
and trying to have a decent conversation with them. But for sure, I'm glad to hear your feedback of recognizing, yeah, I don't fit the mold, the simplistic description that they're trying to convey.
Hmm.
And then the second issue is, the move towards mainline churches. We're starting to see that in the Pew Research data. I've got plenty of friends who have moved from evangelical churches to mainline churches, and I think that's going to be a really common story as well. So it doesn't surprise me, I guess, is all I
Yeah.
wanted to say. So,
Well, and it really was. I don't know, that it kind of felt like freedom, like, because I know that it drives it. My parents would be like, yeah, they're just on the fence, they don't want to take a side, whatever. And the Episcopal Church is famous for the middle way, whatever.
okay.
And for better or worse, for us, and especially at that time, it was really good to just not be so caught up in the culture wars, and not be so caught up in having to have a specific, like, strong argument in favor or against, fill in the blank of the culture war of
Right.
the day,
Exactly. Yeah.
and I think for me, it gave me space to kind of really explore more. It gave me it to me. It's still it's a comfortable place, but I don't really necessarily need it anymore, other than the camaraderie and the community, which you've talked about a lot. But if I do go to, with my wife, I don't, I'm comfortable there, and it's fine, and I can, appreciate the people, and I'm not going to worry about hearing some sermon about, the fires of hell and all these kinds,
Yes.
just some of the stuff that, I grew up with hearing about, and so anyway, it was a really good place to land. And if I had really just wanted to stay Christian, that's where I would still be, because I still have a lot of fondness for it, and um, a lot of good things to say about it.
Yeah.
So then, about that same time, we just had a lot of stuff happen all at once. We bought our first house. I got a new job as a project manager for a company, and then was laid off in a few months. Went
Ooh.
back to school, so all these things happen within a few months of each other. Also, after buying a house, we got our first dog, which that plays into my story more than most people might think. But because at some point, we'd had her for a little while, and she's a dog. She does stuff you don't like, whatever. It happens. They do stupid stuff, and there was some point in there where I don't even remember how I got to thinking about it, but the thought that I'm like, if something were to happen, if she were to do something that I knew she looked right at me and did it because she was mad at me or whatever, like, there's just sometimes dogs have this little attitude,
Yeah.
and I remember thinking about that and thinking I might in the moment be upset with her and might get onto her, might, whatever. But once I've taken care of it, cleaned up the mess, whatever it is that she's done, then she's going to crawl back up in my lap and we're going to be fine, like, and there's nothing in the world that could have made me want to allow her even to be harmed over and over again. And so the whole thought of an eternal fire where you're tortured, like, the disconnect between that and any kind of loving deity, loving anything, like, it just was too much of a disconnect for me. And so that ended up being what ultimately made me like stop believing in hell, because it was like the something's got to give here, like the idea of a loving God and this idea of hell that I grew up with doesn't make sense,
Right.
you know and I mean, there are other ideas of it, just not eternal, not, it's just an end, whatever. There's all kinds of little things, different variations on that, but I still just was like, there's nothing that could make me want to harm her or allow her to be harmed.
Right.
And this is my dog. This is, we don't
Yes.
have kids, so like I
Yeah.
can't imagine it, allowing that. If I had kids, like that would just be an even greater level of care and love, and so that losing that belief in hell ended up again opening, you know, I don't know, like it was a freedom again, like well, I don't have to be afraid of this thing. Let's just keep seeing what else I find, where this leads. And so amazingly enough, getting a dog ended up, moving me on even further down my
That's
down my
that's
road.
awesome. Yeah, that's a wonderful story. But I mean, that's absolutely true, right? The disconnect between God loves you, but if you don't do the right thing, if you don't believe the right way, if you don't, confess the right way, you're going to hell. You're right. It just doesn't make logical sense, right? And
Hmm.
especially what you're describing is the experience of loving someone unconditionally, even though it's your dog. And that's what actual grace is. That's what actual love is. And that disconnect is striking.
Yeah. So that was a huge moment there. And then of course, around that time was when, there was 2010, right? End of 2010, 2011. I've been really trying to figure out what I thought about issues surrounding LGBTQ plus people. That was kind of a big moment for that. and just nothing. Like, it was one of those things where it's like my conscience was saying, but why is this a problem? But everything I'd been taught about the Bible, and even what I mean, I honestly think, yeah, it's hard to read the Bible without coming
Sure.
away with some sort of homophobic sort of reading of it. You can try to smooth over those rough edges, but at some point, like, there's some stuff in there that's kind of hard to explain away. um and so some of those things, like, it's like it just wasn't sitting right with me, and I studied it more and more, and I finally just got to the point where I'm like, I really just don't see where this is an issue. I could not again, it just didn't make any sense to me of why, why is this such a big deal? Like, why, you know, why has this become the big thing? So that was another step kind of along those, like, deconstructing, like, well, here's what the Bible says, but it just doesn't feel right, and I know we can get into dangerous territory when we just go by feelings, but I also couldn't find any, like, reasonable, uh, extra biblical reason why we should have an issue with two men getting married, or two women loving each other. Like, I just couldn't come up with any reason other than the Bible tells me so.
Right.
And that was starting to be less and less of, like, I that's just not enough for me. That was more and more becoming that way, where it was just, I need more than just the Bible tells me so. I need to see some reason. And then every quote unquote reason that wasn't biblical ended up being, like, well, this was a study that was done and it was done horribly. It wasn't done
Right.
correctly, those sort of things. And
Yeah.
it's like, well, if this is your best arguments, like, this is, again, not compelling, like, this is not working for me. So in going through those kinds of studies, like, I think that I was starting to just get more and more to the point where I wanted some, I needed reality in there somewhere. And reality kept bumping up against what I was taught.
Right.
And at some point, I care about truth and reality. And so, you know, the thing that's going to give is probably my understanding of the Bible, or my reading of the Bible, or whatever. At some point I realized that anything you do with the Bible is interpretation. Like, there's no way to get at it. The pure
Right.
reading of it, doesn't exist. So that it was just kind of slowly by slowly whittling away my, you know, I don't know, my assurity, or I don't even know if
Yeah.
that's a word, but like my assurance of the Bible, and of that foundation that was so important to me growing up. I don't know, that just really wasn't working for me anymore.
Yeah.
And so also, I went back to school, started. Uh, I finally decided, well, getting laid off, this is a good time to go back and finish a degree. And um, I had biology class, um,
Okay.
and it was the first time that the scientific method had been, like being homeschooled growing up. I got the whatever Christianese version of conservative Christian,
Right.
young Earth creationism version of the scientific method. And so this was laid out like, this is what scientists do, that and the fact that once you have a once you have an idea or something that you're trying to prove, you're no longer in the realm of science. You're in the realm of pseudoscience at that point. Like, the fact that, like, science works the exact opposite of that, really, like, things just started clicking then. And I was like, oh my gosh, everything that I thought about young Earth creationism and all that was pseudoscience, because we're trying to prove this thing. We're cherry picking. We're, all those things, that this is pure pseudoscience. And so that went by the wayside then once I started, studying on that. And so, again, it was another permission to read up from more people on, things that I wanted to learn more about but didn't really understand. And so I wasn't only going to seek out the apologists or the creationist version. I'm going to seek out what do actual scientists say, and not be afraid of what the answers are. And so that ended up being another, kind of a big step in there. So, this is probably around 2012 ish, 2011, 2012 kind of is where this is all kind of happening. And so then I kind of, like, the next 2 3 years, I think it was just a slow burn of reading new things, more people. I never did. I didn't read any of the the Four Horsemen, any of the big name atheists until just the last year and a half.
Can I comment on that really quick? So going back to our researcher friend, I think that many apologists think that oh well, the culture gets a person, or they read Dawkins and they walk away, they abandon their faith. You're telling my story, right? Of just that slow degradation of what you trust about what Christianity has told you. And it was after the fact. It was way long after the fact that I actually started to read Four Horsemen and
Mm-hmm.
what have you. And so I was actually cognizant of the fact that these people, as I'm reading Dawkins, he's telling me what I now already believe, and I was
Uh-huh.
almost a little skeptical of it. So it's kind of the opposite of what they think is happening, and it's Christianity itself is imploding on a person.
But yeah, which it's interesting you say that because I kind of hesitated to jump right to all those because
Yeah,
you know I mean Dawkins especially is problematic on
sure,
he's
very much so. Yes, yeah, I
several
have.
ways. Sam Harris, same thing. Like there's
Yeah,
just these things that they'll say that's like that kind of makes me cringe a bit.
I
Whatever.
have many criticisms of
Uh huh.
of that era of atheism.
Uh
Yes,
huh. Yes.
yeah,
And so going into it now, like you said, it was like, oh yeah, this is stuff that I already think and already believe, and then some of the things that where they might be problematic, I can be like, yeah, I don't have to agree with them on that. That's your I think you're wrong on that, and I don't have to follow you there. But
yes,
you know, but yeah, so I would say probably during those years where I was really kind of piece by piece deconstructing, learning new things, I was probably reading more people that had been maybe influenced by some of those or had learned some things from them. But it was in those years I started reading Captain Cassidy, and
oh, okay, yeah.
she's through her is how I discovered you. So
Oh,
that's
okay. Yeah.
awesome.
Yeah. She is absolutely a phenomenal blogger.
Yes.
And just the amount of detail that she gets into is,
I'm always amazed.
is
I sometimes
incredible.
have
Yeah.
trouble keeping up with her long posts because they're so
Yes.
detailed and everything. And then if you go down the rabbit hole of the stuff that she links to, then
Right.
like because
Yes.
she'll have tons of extra information, and it's always great. But yeah, she was one. And there were, she was a big one just because she was so insightful and had so much information. But there were, there were quite a number of different people during that time that I really started, reading more of, listening to, and just, I guess at that point was when I was just like, I'm not going to, I'm just, the walls are down. I'm going to just, read whatever. So if there's something I'm interested in, I'm going to read what everyone's saying about it. I'm not going to limit myself and say, I don't know, that's a line too far. I'm not going to listen to that person. I'm going to see what they have to say. And if what they have to say makes sense and is reasonable and fits with, the other data that is out there about whatever topic, then, they might be worth listening to.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, so it was kind of a slow process there for 2, 3 years of kind of slowly deconstructing a little more, a little more, a little more. And then the last drop of the faith pool, is that last drop. I distinctly remember that it was a moment. I want to say it was spring of 2016, somewhere around in there. I was listening to NPR on my way home, and they were doing this story, and I think it was Doctors Without Borders, but if not, it was a group like that. Um, and they were in this, I think it was a refugee camp of some sort, and there was this little girl who was they thought she was maybe a few months old. I think she was like something like 15 or 16 pounds. Come to
Oh,
find out,
okay.
she was 3 years old,
Oh my goodness.
and just the level of her, of pain and suffering that she'd gone through. Like they're trying to help her, and and ultimately she ended up dying. And there was just something there that
Mm.
like it all clicked, and I was like, "There's like, what deity watching out for us is going to allow that to happen?" Which
Yeah.
it was the moment where I was like, I don't. think I believe any of this anymore. It was just this moment of like almost clarity of going, no, like that cannot happen. Like that is the notion of a loving God that would allow that child, innocent child, for 3 years to suffer like that. Like, just no, I can't go with this anymore.
Yeah.
Which I also kind of find interesting, because the problem of evil was not like the catalyst for me leaving. I know that's a lot for a lot of people, that is, but I had all the apologetics answers to that back in, I knew all the free will, blah blah blah, whatever.
Yeah.
But it ended up like I had enough of my faith pool just depleted, that when it hit, that was kind of the last straw. Like, it was just like, yeah, this truly did not make sense.
Yeah.
And so boom, that was it.
I think we Americans have no idea what real suffering is like. Now, I want to caveat that with, I know that there's, the homeless population suffers greatly, and if you want to know, go spend some time helping with the homeless, help feed the homeless. But what you're describing there, around the world in places where food is a scarcity,
Hmm.
is just something that we don't grapple with on any level. And so when it is presented to us in that stark reality, that can be deeply shocking. And obviously I agree with you, but to then juxtapose that against, a loving God who is in control of everything is devastating.
Yeah, it's one of the few moments that I have, like, that I can clearly remember. Like, just I remember where I was, in the car at the time, and it was a huge moment in my own,
Yeah.
development there, because I was just like, oh shit, this is it. I
Yes.
don't I don't believe anymore. And I would say probably the next year or two, I would have said I was agnostic. I was still trying to figure things out, but I was like, I'm pretty sure I don't believe any of this anymore. And so 2 3 years ago, then, is probably when I was finally like, nope, I'm willing to call myself an atheist. I think maybe Matt Dillahunty, who said something, who laid out, like, he's like, and there's probably others who've said this, but like, you know, there's strong atheism, I know there's no God, blah blah blah, and then there's, I don't know if now I can't remember the term, but soft atheism maybe, or whatever. But it's just I just don't believe this. I don't believe
Yeah.
that there is a
I
God,
lack a
and
belief. Yeah.
yeah, it's a lack of belief, and that's, to me, that's when I say that I'm an atheist. That is what it means. Like, I
Sure.
don't believe. Am I open to belief? Sure, if you give me some evidence that there is something, anything out there, then I'm open to that. But I I mean, it would have to be some significant something to make me
Yeah.
truly believe that. And so, yeah, so it's, at this point, I'm just like, no, I don't see any good evidence that there's any being working in the world on our behalf or anything like that.
Right.
And so that's kind of where I've landed now, and I've been kind of here for a few years now, where I'm just like, nope, I don't believe this.
Yeah.
Which those which it was a little bit difficult, because I started teaching Sunday school about the time that I was really starting to question. I was teaching high schoolers, and so then the last year or so that I was teaching high schoolers, I was already firmly in the non-belief category, and was like,
Yeah.
well, this really doesn't work for me anymore. And so I just tried to give them good life advice more so than anything. And it was helpful being the Episcopal Church. I could just kind of teach them, here's what the Episcopal Church teaches on things, and not have to, like, be forceful in my have faith, kids, sort of thing. But it was difficult, that last year or so that I was teaching, because it was just, not really having that belief myself. It felt really strange, and it felt almost like I was walking in two worlds or something.
And you probably feel a little guilty as well.
Hmm.
And yeah, but
Yeah.
I think that's super common, right? You're a committed part of the community,
Hmm.
and you are participating, you're giving back to that community, and you feel obligated to do so. And then suddenly you have a change in your belief system, and that transition can go on for a very long time, right? Like
Hmm.
how do you continue to participate in that community and be honest? That's a really challenging place to be. So
Yeah, it really was. And so then once I stopped teaching the Sunday school, I kind of withdrew a bit. I was still, still active in helping out with things around the church and stuff. And I, to this day, if there's something going on there that they need volunteers for, I'm willing to help out. But, I don't, I just don't go for any of the actual belief side of it anymore.
Would you be willing to talk about how you told your wife and what her response was for that?
Yeah. She had known, my kind of along the way. And like I said, early on, she was probably further along a deconstruction point than I was even. But she did find a place that she feels comfortable in, with the Episcopal Church and with, with the love with her faith that she has now. Like she's comfortable there. She's happy there. And so I can't remember like we didn't exactly have like a sit down and here it is. It was more of as it was slow burning, I kind of would share some stuff with her, and she was kind of right up with me until a certain point when she wasn't anymore,
Exactly.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
then it was just it was a little bit painful then, just to because we weren't on the same page, and
Right.
normally we've been over the years on the same page pretty close,
Right.
for
Right.
most things. And this is one where we're now not. The the thing that is helpful for us, I think, one thing that is helpful is she isn't like all the like she's not going to be like we need to go evangelize these people or anything like that. She doesn't go in
Right.
for the evangelism stuff. The evangelical way of doing church, she is even possibly more disgusted by than I am.
Right.
Um, it never worked for her,
Yeah.
and so that has been helpful. But there, we when we have discussions about church and religion and stuff, like it can just be a little bit dicey because I recognize there's a pain point for her because she knows I don't believe and she does still to some extent, and so um, I think that mutual respect has really carried us for the last few years as we've kind of navigated this,
Absolutely.
because it
Yeah.
has been there've been times where it's been a little bit of a challenge, but I think that we had developed our own, I'm not sure how I want to say this. We um, like we had done a good enough job of saying we're a team, we're going to get through, we're going to go through, like, so thankfully there was never a question of like, is she going to want to leave me over this or anything like that, because I know that can be a thing for some people when they get into this situation. um but it's been a series of conversations, and then sometimes we just don't talk about it.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's the
Yeah.
easiest way to deal with it. Just with this is
Yeah.
not something that we're gonna we don't need to talk about this right now. We'll just
Yeah.
it's not the it's not her primary motivator anymore either, which is nice. She's still involved and still believes, but if this had been 10 years ago, it would have been much harder. If it had been 15 years ago, it would have been I probably would have been a deal breaker sort of thing, or
Yeah.
close to
Yeah.
it. So it's she had moved enough along the path that it made it a little bit easier than for some people, but it's not been without its bumps.
Right. I really think the idea of that mutual respect is so critical. And if it's missing on either end, right? If it takes two to tango. So if you
Mm-hmm.
don't, for the people listening, because I know there's lots of people that are in that scenario, you do need the reciprocal respect. And if
Mm-hmm.
you have to give it, and if you're not receiving it, that's also a problem. And so it can definitely be challenging, but I'm glad to hear that you guys are making it work. And my wife, Michelle, and I are making it work, and it is work, but it's worth it.
Yeah, I really appreciated your the episode you did with the two of you, because you could hear the challenge there.
Yeah.
You could hear that it wasn't all just bed of roses, and you were all
No.
just it's great,
Yes.
but you could also hear the mutual love and respect, I think, and that I think that is what it takes.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. it's okay for you to say no here, but have you talked to your family? Like, your parents were pastors?
About the time I probably would have started talking to our pastors or priests there at the church is about the time the pandemic hit, and I we just stopped going anywhere, and so now for a year and a half, it's just been kind of disconnected. So at some point, I would like to talk to them, but it just hasn't really been a moment for that yet. My littlest sister I've talked to, she knows that I don't believe anymore. Most of the rest of my family, I haven't tried to
Right.
have those discussions with. It's one of those. It's one of those things where I go back and forth because it's like on one hand, I think it would be helpful for them to know that you can be an atheist without being evil. You can be an atheist without being a horrible person. You can be an ethical person and not believe. But on the other hand, like I mean, my mom cried herself to sleep when she found out I would try alcohol. So like,
Okay.
and my
Right.
grandma sent us a letter when she found out that we were going to a denominational church. We were going to the wrong type of church. And so I've debated like where's the level of what's the level of pain I'm willing to put them through because I know that it would be a lot of pain for
Yeah.
them versus just being a little bit more distant from them. Like it's a
I
hard
totally get it.
thing, and
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't know where that line is.
Yeah. And boundaries for you as well. I mean, you have to protect yourself also.
hmm
So I understand that's a murky space to be in.
And I'm fortunate that my most like pretty much all of my friends that I hang out with very often know the there's a couple guys in the band that don't really know. They're the one of the guys in the band in one of my bands that I'm in. He's he's had a very similar deconstruction journey that I have.
Okay.
The other two are still pretty devout, and I just haven't brought it up with them because I haven't had to. But at some point, I probably will. Most of my most of my friends that I hang out with otherwise know, and most of my coworkers know. We don't really have major religious discussions necessarily, but
Sure.
if it comes up, and it's like not that big of a deal. Like, and we even though most of them are still religious, but it's
Yeah.
one of those things. It's like, okay, this is where you are, cool. Like it's just kind of a pretty relaxed thing there. So for the most part, in my day to day life, most everybody I interact with does know where I'm at with things, but my family is just kind of there's been I don't know I've over the years I've kind of Sari and I've cultivated our own life, and our families are involved but not heavily involved, and so it's one of those things where I'm like, it really, like you said, there's the boundaries for me. I don't really want to have them handing me the case for
Yeah.
Christ and stuff like that, but
Yeah.
also just that level of that the causing of pain, like I don't want to cause pain if I can help it, and so I've debated back and forth, and I still don't know where. I think that it might happen at some point, but my little sister did open up. We talked some, and I could tell that it wasn't going to be a major pain point for her, and so it just she knows. But yeah, the rest of my family is not that.
I did not get a chance to tell my mom before I lost her. So like, it was a pretty quick time period, but I know exactly what that feels like. I did not want to just crush her.
hmm
And so I was very, very hesitant. And so I get it. Jason, you've already mentioned Captain Cassidy, who I can't recommend enough. We'll put links in the show notes there. But what other things did you find helpful either during the process or after the process that have been meaningful for you?
So some of the ones, the friendly atheist is one that I've found helpful at different times.
Yeah.
He did a series of videos several years ago that he was just kind of laying out some thoughts that I found to be very helpful, and now I probably should have gone and looked them up to give you an idea what they were, but it was kind of like, here's a question Christians ask, and here's my response from an atheist perspective, sort of thing. There's a guy named Steve Shives who did a
Uh huh.
series on YouTube called An Atheist Reads, where he would go through and read a chapter of an apologetics book and basically respond to it from an atheist perspective. And I found those to be very helpful, just in like giving me ideas of like, okay, I should probably look at this more, because here's something that the apologists will say, and so I should look more into it. I could hear what he had to say, but then I could also kind of go look more for myself. He's since stopped doing those, so there you'd have to kind of go back in his archives to find them. And the reason he said is there aren't any new arguments coming out.
Exactly.
He's tired of rehashing the same ones over and over and over again.
that is, you've just entirely encapsulated my problem with apologetics, is that there really truly isn't a new argument, right? It's variations. There's more sophisticated variations, but it's all under the hood the same arguments that have centuries of arguments against them. And
Yep. So yeah, that one was helpful. And I'm trying to think of some of the others that those were some big ones, and now I'm blanking on others.
You mentioned Matt Dillahunty as well.
Oh yeah, Matt Dillahunty is one that and he's more of the debate side of things, which I don't know if I'm as down on it as you are on the debate side of things, but I'm not like you. I'm not really there. Like, I think that was more helpful for me earlier on, and I still kind of track some of it, but like, I don't really care to watch a debate between Matt or anybody and somebody else about whether the resurrection happened or whatever. So he's one that I did find helpful at different times. There's a guy, if you're interested in things that are especially having to do with young earth creationism, there's a guy called Paulogia on YouTube who does some pretty good, step-by-step information on that stuff.
Yeah. And Paul, if you're listening, I want to get you on the show. So yes,
that would be great.
Paulogia is great. I love his work, and mainly because it isn't aggressive, right? It isn't necessarily, it's debate adjacent, but he's just kind of laying out the facts, and I appreciate his work a lot.
Yeah. So there's some good stuff out there, and I definitely had to learn that you have to be careful with what you come across, especially in the YouTube sphere and whatnot, because there's some, just because I agree with you that there's probably not a God doesn't mean I'm gonna, doesn't mean you're not an asshole or whatever. Yes, so you might you might run into some you might run into some people out there that are not such great people to listen to, but there are quite a few good ones out there that you can kind of listen to. And then if you really want to get into the the Four Horsemen and all that kind of stuff, that's definitely something someone can do if they're really wanting to get the hard arguments against faith. But again, I think that is all dependent on where you are in the process, and I don't know that that's a great place to start personally.
I would just add, I know I was just asking you for your opinion. I'm going to add my opinion really quickly to just say the books that I began to really appreciate were more humanism focused. Mm-hmm. So Greg Epstein's Good Without God, Catherine Osmond's Grace Without God, books along those lines, where it was beyond just, we don't believe, to, hey, this is how we can be good to people in the world. Mm-hmm. And that's what I really found value in, after that initial kind of anger phase that you go through, that kind of thing.
I think that it's, for me anyway, I deconstructed, pushed all the walls, they all fell down, I tested all the things, and none of it stood up. But then I needed to build something, because it's easy to say, well, I don't believe in this, but then what do I believe, So then when you deconstruct your, what I grew up believing was morality came from God. So where do I get my morals from? All those kind of things. And so, reading more about humanism and things, I think, has helped, kind of build up something, a new foundation, for those big questions that everyone still asks.
Exactly. Yeah. Jason, I really appreciate you coming on the show to tell your story. I think a number of things people are going to really relate to. So thank you.
Well, thank you for having me.
Final thoughts on the episode. There's a lot here in Jason's story. I didn't expect for us to talk about apologetics so much, Lee Strobel in particular. I recently was on a podcast called the Steph Up Podcast, and Stephanie is a Christian, and I was trying to explain to her that apologetics in general are convincing to the believers. And once you have even a modicum of skepticism, those apologetic arguments become paper thin. And so even in Jason's case, a dedicated Christian, and in my case, at the time, a dedicated Christian, apologetics begins to wear as you recognize the flimsiness of the arguments. It's not even so much that the arguments are flimsy, but rather that the presuppositions that are required for them to be convincing are the very thing that they are trying to prove. And as we talked about in the episode, Jason rightly points out it is the polar opposite of the scientific method. So apologetics begins with something it is already trying to prove: the existence of God, a young earth creation, intelligent design, what have you, and then finds evidence to prove that. The scientific method does the exact opposite. It looks at what is the data, what do we observe, what do we find, and what conclusions can we make from that. And it's just a completely opposite process. For sure, for me, that was part of my deconversion, was beginning to approach it from the bottom up instead of top down, and things began to fall apart. I love Jason's heart here. His team mentality with his wife, that they have mutual respect, that they love one another even while they are unequally yoked. The love of his dog tells him what real grace is, and that hell can't be a part of that, or punishment can't be a part of that. But another really key insight that Jason has is this idea of every time we look at the Bible, it is an interpretation. And so he says, anything you do with the Bible is interpretation. So how do we know that this interpretation of the Bible is more correct than this other one? And there are polar opposites. There are thousands of versions of Christianity. So that was also a part of my deconversion, as well as that recognition that there is no arbiter of truth between positions of faith. I do want to shout out, Jason and I really very much respect Captain Cassidy from Roll to Disbelieve blog. Highly recommend her blog. It is, as we described, in depth, and she has a talent for pointing out the obvious. So I had an interview with Captain Cassidy in 2019, I believe, that I will put links in the show notes, and as well as the links to Roll to Disbelieve. I want to thank Jason for being on the podcast, for sharing his story. I love his heart. You can tell that he is doing secular grace, that he loves the people around him, and he loves truth. Thank you, Jason, for sharing your story with us. The secular grace thought of the week is to acknowledge how much our relationships with one another are the meaning in our life. Again, this is something I mentioned on the Step Up podcast, but it's kind of been proven true to me lately. I've had some big successes in work lately that pale in comparison to some of the time that I've gotten to spend over the summer with my wife and my daughters. We've had really good family time this summer, and I can't tell you how much that has meant to me, that it is so much more important than the podcast, than work, than anything else. And that is truly where I find meaning and joy in my life, is with the people, with friends, with coworkers, and with family. And secular grace means I believe in people. So believe in one another, love one another, and let's go and do good in the world. Until next time, my name is David, and I am trying to be the graceful atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. Time for the footnotes. The beat is called Waves from Mackay Beats. Links will be in the show notes. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can promote it on your social media. You can subscribe to it in your favorite podcast application, and you can rate and review it on podchaser.com. You can also support the podcast by clicking on the affiliate links for books on gracefulatheist.com. If you have podcast production experience and you would like to participate with the podcast, please get in touch with me. Have you gone through a faith transition and do you need to tell your story? Reach out. If you are a creator or work in the deconstruction, deconversion, or secular humanism spaces and would like to be on the podcast, just ask. If you'd like to financially support the podcast, there's links in the show notes. To find me, you can Google Graceful Atheist. You can Google Deconversion. You can Google Secular Grace. You can send me an email, gracefulatheist@gmail.com, or you can check out the website, gracefulatheist.com. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. This has been the Graceful Atheist Podcast.